In other words, I don't disagree with the idea that if the Palestinians of the West Bank were given a state tomorrow, that would likely turn toward Hamas, and then
at best it'll be another failed Arab state, and most likely it'll just be another Iranian proxy state. So well done, all you kids on campus who thought that everything in the world would unfurl into peace if another rotten state was created in the Middle East.
But then occupation forever?
No. Everywhere it tells you nothing about the Jews. What it tells you about is the person who suffers from anti-Semitism. And as Grossman says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. Let me give you the supreme example of that. The Arab world and the Muslim world accuses Israel of being a colonial state. It's so funny. Islam is one of the great colonial projects in history. In history. The Muslim world expanded through violent colonialism. Now, that doesn't mean that all Muslims approve of that or love it, but they certainly live in the history of that. One of the Hamas terrorists had killed her best friend in front of her. And they were debating whether or not they should take her into Gaza or kill her. And she was screaming, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. And they shot her through the face, and she was still shouting that when her face fell off. That's what these guys are.
As missiles rain down on Israel and Iran teeters on the brink of igniting World War III, Douglas Murray unleashes a blistering critique of the West's feeble response to Middle East chaos. 1 year after the October 7th attack, Murray rips apart the moral bankruptcy infecting our institutions and media. Are our leaders lost in a fog of virtue signaling while campuses become radical echo chambers? Murray skewers peacemakers, whose cowardice emboldens terror, contrasting Western floundering with Israel's resolute grit. This isn't just commentary, it's a battle cry for civilization itself. Brace yourself for an explosive journey through the minefield of modern geopolitics. Are you ready to face the gruesome and uncomfortable truth?
From the Free Press, this is Honestly, and I'm Barry Weiss. Now, when we planned tonight's conversation, I imagined that we would sort of be looking back, right? We were going to release it on October 7th, which is, I think today's Tuesday, which is next Monday. And I thought we were going to sort of be looking back at the past year from a slightly quieter vantage point. But then today happened. And quiet is sort of the last thing that's happening right now in the Middle East. The war that Iran has outsourced to its proxies since October 7th, 2023, has now become a war between Iran explicitly and Israel. Hours before we sat down right here in this room in New York City, Iran launched over 100 ballistic missiles toward Israel. Israel's 9 million citizens huddled in bomb shelters, many of them friends and family of many people in this room. A handful of them made direct impact, and as of this recording, 2 were injured and 1 person was killed. That 1 person happened to be a Palestinian man walking on the street in Jericho. Just before that onslaught, of course, 2 terrorists, at least 2 of them, opened fire at the train station in Jaffa, killing at least 6 people and injuring at least 7 others. Now, for many of us in this room tonight, this war has been primary on our mind for the past 360 or so days. But I think for a lot of Americans, it still feels like a faraway war, right? And it isn't, right? This is a battle for the free world. As our mutual friend Sam Harris put it in the weeks after October 7th, there are not many bright lines that divide good and evil in our world. This is one of them. This is a war, yes, between Israel and Iran, but it's also a war between civilization and barbarism. And that was true 360 some days ago. And it's even more true today, I think. And yet, this testing moment has been met with alarming moral confusion. I want to choose just a few examples from the last week, and I'm sure everyone here will be familiar with these. At the UN, 12 countries, including the US, presented a plan for a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon without mentioning the word Hezbollah. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib tweeted, "Our country is funding this bloodbath minutes after Israel assassinated the leader of the most fearsome terrorist army on the planet, Hassan Nasrallah, who the New York Times described as beloved, a towering figure, and a powerful orator." We read it out loud at my home. It sounded like a letter of recommendation. At Barnard, just 40 or so blocks from here, students chanted this week for an intifada moments after the Jewish community memorialized 6 civilian hostages murdered by Hamas. At Yale this week, students chanted from Gaza to Beirut, "All our martyrs, we salute." In Ottawa, protesters, if you think it's bad in America, Canada's somehow worse. In Ottawa, protesters shouting, "O Zionists, where are you?" walked through a Jewish residential street filled with schools and homes for the elderly.
The Middle East chaos escalates as Iran's missiles rain on Israel. Yet the West's moral compass spins like a drunk ballerina. Missiles fly, civilians die, but some can't even name the aggressor. The UN's ceasefire plan? A toothless tiger without claws. College campuses are now terror cheerleading camps, and people won't stop treating terror like a misunderstood teenager. This isn't just a regional spat, it's civilization versus barbarism.
Why did they do that? Because it was a street with Jewish schools and home for the elderly. And that's just a few examples from the past week. The reason we are sitting here having this conversation is because no one that I know understands the moral urgency of this moment better than you, Douglas Murray. Now, you're not Jewish. You have no Israeli family members, although I know a lot of Israeli families that consider you an adopted family member. And yet, it is you, more than almost anyone in the world, who has articulated the stakes of this war and the moral clarity that it requires. Douglas's work as a reporter has taken him to Iraq, North Korea, northern Nigeria, Ukraine, and most recently, of course, to Israel, where he became a celebrity. You cannot walk down the streets of Tel Aviv without Douglas Murray. It's like being with the Beatles, and I'm not exaggerating. And you decided to stay, a conversation I want to have with you, to cover most of that war. You're also the best-selling author of 7 books, and you're a regular contributor at the New York Post, which is the paper of record in New York City, the National Review, and most importantly, I think, at the Free Press, where you write the beloved Sunday column, Things Worth Remembering, which is reason enough to become a paid Free Press subscriber. There is just no one I would rather be sitting with in this moment as we are watching in real time the Middle East and really the world transform before our eyes. So Douglas Murray, welcome to Honestly, and thanks so much for being here.
Great pleasure to be with you, Barry.
Okay, so we are speaking on the eve of what some people, and I'm sure your phone was blowing up in the way mine was all afternoon, of what some people are saying this is it. Like, this is the beginning of World War III. At the very least, this is the moment, sort of, that we've, in a weird way, been waiting for, if you can say such a thing, since October 7th. This is the mask-off moment.
The West's spineless appeasement of terror is nauseating. Pathetic appeasers masquerade as peacemakers, while Israel bleeds. Our so-called leaders, drunk on virtue signaling, are sleepwalking us into oblivion. They prattle about peace while anti-Semitism festers like a wound. Meanwhile, the real heroes are vilified. It's a sick joke. Hamas uses hospitals as bunkers, and we're supposed to cry for them. This isn't a conflict. It's good versus evil.
The first question I want to ask you is, how did we get here? How did we get to a moment where Iran is dropping 100 ballistic missiles on Israel, and Israel is vowing to respond to it? What are the factors that led us to this moment?
Probably just like the Finland station, the terrible decision to allow a train to arrive in Russia in 1917 carrying Lenin. The plane that took off in 1979 from Paris, taking to Tehran the Ayatollah Khomeini, is one of the 2 worst journeys of the 20th century. And all of this starts from there. Iran had the opportunity to be a sort of progressive country in the region. In the 1970s, Israel had an ambassador in Iran, as you know. there was the opportunity for normalization along the same lines as what happened between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, in more recent years with the Abraham Accords. But the revolutionary Islamic government in Tehran chose a different path. It's a millenarian, apocalyptic terror movement that has immiserated the people of Iran since what is also coincidentally the year of my birth. And the revolutionary Islamic government has decided to oppress the people it presumes to govern and to try to expand itself across the region. And my worry early in the period after October 7th was that Israel would spend all of its political and military capital defeating Hamas. And I never thought that that was the aim. I thought that the aim was to defeat Hamas and then make sure that every other terror proxy of Iran, of the Iranian revolutionary government, as I should always remember to say, and as I always remind my good Iranian friends that I should say, because we shouldn't say it's Iran, it's not, it's that disgusting regime. My worry was always that Hamas would take up all of the energy and that Israel wouldn't be allowed, as it were, to do what else needed to be done. Almost a year on, we could look back with all of the grief and sadness and horror about what happened on the 7th and the losses of many fine soldiers fighting Hamas house to house in Gaza. But as it happens, as we come to the first anniversary, the tide has turned. And the Israeli government and the Israeli armed forces and military have shown that there is a price to pay for trying to eradicate the Jewish people. And the price is being paid, and it's high, and it should always have been high, and it will probably get higher. This is a point of clarification. The Iranian Revolutionary Government used to enjoy sending rockets into Israel from Gaza using its proxy Hamas. Hamas is almost completely destroyed.
Iran's apocalyptic regime, not content with oppressing its own people, now rains missiles on Israel, daring the world to blink. Now Israel fights a multi-headed hydra of terror, while armchair critics cry proportionality. Newsflash, when faced with extinction, measured responses are a luxury. This isn't a conflict, it's a battle for civilization. But please, keep preaching peace while rockets rain. Your moral myopia is showing, and it's pathetically out of fashion.
Its cowardly leader, Yahya Sinwar, is hiding in a tunnel somewhere in the south of Gaza, surrounded by what he would regard as being the best hostages. That's his end. But his colleagues, his comrades, they've all gone. They've lost. They're in the dust of Gaza, and no one misses them. In the north, Hezbollah was meant to be the great army of the Tehran mullahs. In less than 2 weeks, Hezbollah has been utterly destroyed. First of all, 3,000 of their operatives had the misfortune, believing, as they may have been right to believe they couldn't trust their cell phones, decided to go to the old-fashioned pager devices. But someone, we don't know who, put explosives in all of those pager devices. And so 3,000 of their operatives in one moment across Lebanon and Syria all suffered grievous injury. The next day, their walkie-talkies blew up. By day 3, they couldn't trust to put on a kettle in Beirut. Then the senior membership of Hezbollah that still remained met in a building, and then they were struck. And then, best of all, when Benjamin Netanyahu came to New York last week, he went on stage to the UN. I watched from the gallery as the traditional walkout of various despots and dictators and their minions occurred. As he was doing it, somewhere in Beirut, Hassan Nasrallah was watching Benjamin Netanyahu on television, and that's when Hassan Nasrallah went to meet his maker.
It's like the baptism scene from The Godfather.
It's
It is.
I was told by a Jewish friend the other day that apparently there is something in Torah, in the Jewish tradition, that says that one should not take enormous delight in the decimation of one's foes. But I'm not Jewish. And so I don't have to follow this. Hassan Nasrallah and the other people who have just also gone to the dust have not just spent recent decades killing Israelis, kidnapping them from the border regions, firing rockets at people and communities across the north of Israel. They killed 241 American Marines in 1983, and they got away with it. They got away with it. They killed French soldiers. They killed many other foreign nationals. They killed people. They kidnapped them. They got away with it. Not anymore. As Benjamin Netanyahu said when he spoke at Congress in July, he said, "This war is your war. Our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory."
Hezbollah and Hamas finally receive a bombastic taste of their own medicine. These merchants of misery, who've spent decades perfecting the art of murder, suddenly find themselves on the receiving end. Karma's a blast, isn't it? While some preach restraint, remember these are not mere militants. They are architects of decades of suffering. They're cold-blooded killers who've long evaded justice. Still feeling sympathetic? Maybe it's time to recalibrate your moral compass.
Now, that's Hezbollah, the organization formerly known as Hezbollah, or whatever we will have to call them. They've lost almost all of the ammunition they've stored up to fire at Israel all these decades. The United Nations was meant to oversee a resolution. I remember I was there in the war in 2006, and I remember the war finishing, and I remember the United Nations all calling for a ceasefire again. And all of the years afterwards, it turns out, lo and behold, you don't have to follow United Nations resolutions if you don't want to. And the Hezbollah did not want to, and so they built up their rocket arsenal, and most of that has been destroyed in recent days. So that's Iran's proxy to the north. The Houthis in Yemen, everyone's favorite new terrorists, recently discovered by morons on American campuses, well, they're not doing too well either. Because it turns out that if you do the bidding of your paymasters in Tehran and you fire missiles at Israel, you'll be taken out too. So now is the point of clarification. The mullahs in Tehran do not any longer have active proxies able to try to destroy the Jewish state. They've gone in Gaza. They've gone in Lebanon, in the process of going. They're going in Yemen. So it's the mullahs versus Israel.
So what happens next? I mean, you are deeply, deeply sourced in Israel, and you've become somewhat close, I think, to the prime minister, who has said in sort of no uncertain terms he's going after the mullahs next. He's also been saying that for a while. It's only now become more and more explicit. What do you think the next few weeks looks like, if you can share that?
Well, if I can't speak for the prime minister, but I would just say that it seems obvious that if Tehran is going to fire ballistic missiles at Israel, Israel has to be allowed to reply in kind. But the Israeli way of war is a way of war that is, of course, for them it's existential. As Golda Meir famously said, we can't afford to lose once. And the mullahs have made their choice. Is it possible that they could be punished in a way that would be something which would topple the regime? Maybe. I don't know if Israel can do that alone or if America needs to do it with them. But just imagine what the region would look like if that flight had not been allowed to land in 1979. All of this would have not happened. God knows the Palestinians could have had another state. But the mullahs chose their route, and they're losing.
The Middle East's puppet masters, once untouchable, now dance to a funeral dirge. Their grand chessboard, shattered. UN resolutions, paper tigers, from Gaza to Yemen, their dominoes topple, revealing the hollowness of their power. As Israel readies its fist, we stand at history's crossroads. The mullah's empire of sand dissolves, leaving us to rue our past weakness. This isn't just justice, it's a seismic shift, reshaping a region long held hostage by terror's architects.
Let's talk about America and its relationship to Israel in this moment. Because on the one hand, Joe Biden has declared he's a Zionist. America is still Israel's most important ally. It gives it tons of foreign aid. And we could go on and on and on if we wanted to make the case for this White House on that score. But on the other hand, you could make a very different argument, which is you could argue that the roots of what we're seeing play out tonight over the skies of Israel goes back to the Obama administration and to an embrace of a sort of rapprochement with Iran. I wondered if you could sort of comment on that and whether the past 24 hours are kind of like mark-to-market moment for that foreign policy worldview. Like, is that over? Has that been fully shattered and collapsed? Or are we still going to have to pretend as if, well, you tell me.
Well, Herb Stein's law, things that cannot go on won't. It's a law that economists are fond of. In foreign policy establishment, things that cannot go on usually do. There are two completely defunct paradigms which is still being pursued in Washington, Paris, and London. Number one, that if you give the Palestinians yet another state, by which I mean not being given a state in 2005 in Gaza isn't enough, and everything they've done since isn't enough. Let's give them another one because maybe next time they won't decide to do a genocidal state again. First thing is this idea that Anthony Blinken said a couple of days after the 7th of October, this is why we need to double down on the two-state solution. What, you want another Palestinian state in order to become another terror state? And you reward them for the terror by giving them another state? That's delusion number one. Delusion number two is this idea that, and my gosh, the Obama administration was the worst at this, was this idea that you wait for the moderate reformer to appear under the mullahs in Tehran. Every single Iranian president in my lifetime who has come, every prime minister, every foreign minister, is always saying, the reformist. I mean, it's not even reformist in that, the hardliners are kill all the Jews and the reformists are kill most. It's not even that. It's that they don't come. The regime is set up in such a way they don't come. It was always a delusion of the Obama administration and others. You could coax the Ayatollahs to the table. They don't want to be at the table. If they wanted to be at the table, if they wanted to be this reformist thing, they wouldn't have set up this death trap in southern Lebanon, which, in my view, and the view of many others, was always there in order to get the opportunity of the mullahs to get atomic weaponry, genocidal weaponry to fire at the Jewish state, and to have Hezbollah there in order to make sure that Israel and America never struck the nuclear reactors, or if they did, all 160,000 missiles would start being pointed at would be fired at Tel Aviv and Haifa. That has been taken away from them now. But
our Middle East policy is a circus of delusions. We've been chasing unicorns, moderate mullahs, and peaceful terrorists. Brilliant. Let's reward the genocidal maniacs with more land and nukes. Our weakness isn't diplomacy, it's insanity. We've fed the crocodile, hoping it'll eat us last. Now, as missiles rain and blood flows, reality shatters our fairy tales. It's time to bury these deadly fantasies and face the harsh truth. Appeasement breeds aggression.
The illusion that the revolutionary Islamic government can be brought into the fold is what many people, John Kerry, Jack Straw, these people all thought this was the case. They've been proven wrong again and again. And in recent days and weeks, we've had the spectacle of people who have never had to see a war, let alone fight one, saying all the time that Israel has to go for a ceasefire. They were flat out wrong.
Well,
Kamala Harris said, don't go into Rafah. Rafah was the stronghold of Hamas in Gaza. The IDF went into Rafah. They got a lot more of the senior leadership of Hamas, as we knew they would. They got some more hostages back. But Kamala Harris said she'd looked at the maps and she knew better because, I mean, after all, nobody in the IDF has ever looked at the maps, I'm sure. And then in recent days, we have the situation with Lebanon. It's all oh, the Israelis are attacking Lebanon. No, they are freeing Lebanon from Hezbollah. Lebanon used to be a relatively progressive and prosperous country for the region. It had many Christians, among others, and an extraordinary, even for the Middle East, an unbelievable petri dish of traditions and ancient communities. And they have been decimated by Hezbollah, by this Shiite militia of Iran in Lebanon. And Israel goes in to get Hezbollah out, and the American government says ceasefire. No, not ceasefire, victory. Should always have been about victory. You cannot keep fighting wars that you're not allowed to win. And that's what I said from the very first moment after the 7th. Every single time Israel is made to fight wars it is not allowed to win. We in the international community were expected to see it as normal that every 15 to 20 years Israel had to fight a war in southern Lebanon. Every 2 to 3 years it had to fight a war in Gaza. Why? Every single time because the international community, including American administrations, tried to stop them and did stop them before the moment of victory. There was an Israeli politician and general who I spoke with early in this conflict who said, I had the opportunity to snuff out Hamas entirely in 2010, and I was pulled back by my government at the demand of the American government and the international community. Well done those people. Well done the people who sustained that status quo. It meant we had war after war, and now they have this. This is the fruit of their labor.
Decades of spineless diplomacy have birthed a monster. Our peace-loving politicians, armchair generals with clean hands and dirty consciences, have perpetuated an endless cycle of bloodshed. Their misguided mercy is cruelty in disguise. Every ceasefire, every half measure, every proportionate response has only fed the beast. Now, as Israel finally strikes for victory, these same fools cry foul. Their hypocrisy stinks to high heaven. True peace demands decisive action, not cowardly compromises.
We now know from Financial Times reporting over the past few days that Israel, in the days after October 7th, had a way, or they believe they had a way, to get Nasrallah, and the Americans stopped them. And there's story after story about how the Americans sort of interceded. And the theme that emerges for me is they seem to view not the terrorist group, not Iran, not Islamic totalitarianism as the enemy, but escalation itself as the enemy.
Yes, and the problem is that when you need to win a war, you need to escalate. Absolutely, you need to escalate. And, by the way, I don't know. Everything I ever know about, when I read a story about it in the Financial Times, they're always wrong. It's possible they're right on something to do with Ecuadorian politics every now and then. I don't know. But on anything I know about it, the Financial Times doesn't seem to me to be a very very respectable journal. But maybe they're right. I heard that rumor from elsewhere. Of course, the whole thing is always about de-escalation. Always de-escalation. This is this madness, as again, of people, governments drunk on peace, thinking that peace is the only thing that should ever happen. And you don't need to go back to Ecclesiastes to know this, but perhaps we can. To everything there is under the sun there is a season, and the list includes a time of war and a time of peace. This is a time of war, and it was a war started by the mullahs in Tehran when they decided to send their barbarians into Israel on the 7th to rape and burn and murder their way. They chose the war. The Israelis want a time of peace. Most people in the region want a time of peace. But in order to get to peace, you have to get to victory in war.
Our spineless peacemakers have become war's greatest enablers. Their pathetic obsession with de-escalation is a terrorist's dream come true. Every ceasefire is a gift to barbarians. Every compromise a nail in peace's coffin. They'd rather see endless bloodshed than decisive victory. This isn't diplomacy, it's surrender on the installment plan. True peace demands the courage to escalate, to crush evil swiftly and completely. Only through total victory can we forge lasting peace.
Speaking of publications you admire, I want to quote something from the BBC. today. Shortly after Iran launched these ballistic missiles against Israel, one of its commentators said this, and I promise you it is not satire. The international community has to make sure that whatever Israel does is not upending the regional order as we know it. We've been in this for 12 months now, of constant red lines being crossed, mostly by the Israelis. Hezbollah and Iran have played it fairly rationally, trying to always be cautious in how they respond, trying to leave off-ramps where they could.
Yeah, I know. This is a. By the way, this moron is a teacher at King's College in London. He worked for 4 years for the Qatari government. He was in the pay of the Qatari government. He now teaches at King's College London, which is funded by the Qataris. Why the British Broadcasting Corporation should be inviting on people who are in the pay of Qatar, which is the mini terror state to Iran's great terror state in the region, I don't know. But that's why you get moronic commentary like that. I know, it's so sad. It's so sad that the regional status quo of firing missiles at Israel can't be retained, isn't it? It's barbaric, isn't it? The same thing happened on after one of the recent bouts in against Hezbollah. One of the BBC, Sky commentators said that Hezbollah had been appallingly provoked by Israel, provoked beyond toleration, really. Poor Hezbollah. There they were, simply wanting to launch rockets in peace. and then they got disrupted. It's beastly. Absolutely beastly. No, the status quo that has existed was rancid and rotten and anti-Israel, and it had no right to continue. But these people, I mean, we have to ask ourselves in all these institutions, how do you end up with one of these Qatari stooges at a Qatari-funded institution in London, giving his Qatari propaganda for a terror state on the British Broadcasting Corporation? It's rot all the way down. Rot in the media, supported by rotted institutions of rotten states like Qatar, which think they've bought us.
And maybe they have.
Oh, we should turn that round. They think they own us. They are one of the weakest states in the world. It's a few 100,000 people,
and yet
with a disgusting crime family at its head, and the people own slave after slave in that country. It's a slave-owning state with a couple of 100,000 people who actually have some money, and they think they've bought America and Britain? Seriously?
Well, we're cheap. That's the lesson I'm taking from the fact that some of our greatest universities are willing to have outposts in these countries.
Yeah, and
our
same thing with
bankers,
funding Qatar and American
bankers,
universities.
our sports teams spit,
yes.
and you will hit
Yeah.
someone in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's a paid up. I don't know. We're not going to say a Qatari agent, but on the Qatari payroll in some way.
Yeah.
How is that allowed to happen?
Well, look, it seems to be quite easy to seize Russian assets if you don't like Vladimir Putin's actions in recent years. Fine, get the Qataris. Why not?
Our institutions are rotting from the inside out. Universities, media, even sports teams, all bought and paid for by petro-dictators and slave-owning despots. These tin pot tyrants think they've purchased our souls with their blood money. And why not? We've proven embarrassingly cheap. Our prestigious institutions bend over backwards for Qatari cash, while spewing their propaganda. Why do we roll out the red carpet for these miniature merchants of terror?
In recent years, it was agreed by the international community that has some moral clarity on some issues some of the time that you're not allowed to roll tanks into Ukraine and try to seize Ukraine. And as a result of that, all these people associated with Vladimir Putin had those super yachts taken. Fine. Show the Qataris how it's done. Take their stuff. Seize it. See how they run as a state when they can't protect themselves, and see whether their slave class that they import to literally act as slaves in the 21st century are going to stay around. They think we're vulnerable. We make them vulnerable.
But the fact that they have been able to penetrate the West in the way that they have,
Yes, 'cause
with
we're
such
weak.
ease, shows our weakness.
Yes, because we're weak and we're silly and we're drunk on peace.
Let's get back to that in a minute. I want to ask you one question about Ukraine since you brought it up. One I wouldn't even call it an emergent phenomenon. I think it's now become the consensus on large portions of the American right, is that Israel, let's support that war, but Ukraine, let's give up on those guys, to be very crude about it. I would say Israel has become almost a conservative cause, and Ukraine has become a liberal cause. And I find this quite strange, because the way that I see it, these two conflicts are profoundly and deeply linked. But you're a conservative, and many of your fellow conservatives no longer see it that way. What are they seeing? And what's the case you would make to them that the cause of Ukraine should also be the cause of those that support Israel?
Well, the cause of Ukraine is obvious, and which is it's a sort of rather basic lesson from the 20th century that you shouldn't be allowed to roll tanks into other countries with impunity. Used to be rather widely recognized, and also it's never quite a good idea to start redrawing the borders of the outskirts of Europe, because you can open up an awful lot of old enmities that way. There's quite a lot of trouble in that part of the world.
But tell that to J.D. Vance or Donald Trump.
Well, I think they get that. I think that the problem that's happened with the right on Ukraine is, well, you're right that it's become a sort of left-wing shibboleth, you know, that people who've never...
Their heuristic is the same people that put up the black square in 2020 and then put the pronouns in their bio, then put up the Ukraine flag, ergo we shouldn't support Ukraine.
Exactly, which is all true, and I mean there are a lot of irritating people out there. But just because people are irritating does not mean that you can form your foreign policy in opposition to irritating people. The thing with that has changed on the right with Ukraine, as I see it, is that after the spring offensive last year failed, and it did fail, it was not clear that Ukraine was going to continue to be able to seize land back from Putin. I was with the Ukrainian armed forces when they retook Kherson and Mykolaiv, and it was a very heady time. But there were not further land gains like that. And when the spring offensive failed, I think quite a lot of people thought it's likely this is, I mean, Henry Kissinger, among others, said this at the time, you know, it seems that there's going to be some kind of negotiated settlement will include a change of borders in the region. And once people started to see that, then yes, a lot of support fell away.
The right's Ukraine betrayal is a geopolitical disaster. Blinded by petty culture wars, they've stumbled into Putin's trap. Their myopic tribalism ignores the glaring parallels between Ukraine and Israel's struggles. Both nations stand against authoritarian aggression, yet conservatives foolishly treat them as separate issues. This dangerous disconnect threatens to unravel decades of hard-won stability. Freedom's fight doesn't end at convenient borders. Our enemies are laughing as we sabotage ourselves.
By the way, when you see the people on the left saying, we will support Ukraine till the absolute end, no, they won't. They won't. The Germans have already been pulling back. They fall away. They fall away. And this is, by the way, one of the things about war. There is nothing at all that compares with winning. If you don't win, that's everything. Shortly after the 7th, a rabbi in London is a very nice man, but he's reform. And I'm not. I'm a non-Jewish ultra-Orthodox Jew. And
Sitting in the front row, our host, I should say, is a reform rabbi.
I know, but I have my criticisms anyway. I mean, I just. No. But.
We'll get you the black hat.
A very nice reform rabbi said to me, you know, I sometimes worry, Douglas, that you talk about things in a way that's too binary. And, you know, things aren't binary. And I said, well, actually, some things are. Yeah. And he said, like what? I said, win, lose. That's it. Give me a clearer binary in the world. You win a war and you've won it. You lose it, got nothing to stand on. It's over. You don't own your own land. You don't have your own army. You can't protect your family. You can't stop your people being killed. Now look, Ukraine has, as I say, fallen into a sort of torpor as a war, and a lot of people want to end it, and a lot of people think it'll probably just have to be settled by some gruesome and difficult land swap. Who knows? Israel is different on this because there is the glimpse, a clear sight at this point, particularly after recent weeks, there is a sight of what victory looks like. And that is what makes these conflicts at this stage different. It makes it wildly different because it is clear at this point how this war in the Middle East could end. And it's possible also, and this perhaps doesn't get said often enough, it's possible once again to see what the Middle East could look like if these two delusions fell away. If instead of everyone obsessing about the Palestinians getting another state, they thought about improving the living conditions of the Palestinians. If instead of talking about the importance of bringing Iran in from the cold, the mullahs in from the cold, we talked about if Washington had spent 1% of the time it has spent trying to get Benjamin Netanyahu out of power in Jerusalem, trying to get the mullahs out of power in Tehran, the mullahs would be out of power in Tehran by now. Every American government for 30 years has been trying to get Benjamin Netanyahu out of office. Bill Clinton sent teams of people over to get Netanyahu to lose the election in the 90s. When Netanyahu says in his memoirs, Bill Clinton calls him up to congratulate him after he wins the prime ministership, gets together the coalition, and Bill Clinton says, well, we did everything we could to keep you out, but we're looking forward to working with you. Okay, but
Our foreign policy is a circus of fatal contradictions. We preach democracy while propping up tyrants, attempting to dismantle legitimate democratic governments, champion human rights while ignoring Palestinian suffering. This bipolar approach breeds nothing but contempt. War demands clarity, not wishy-washy diplomacy. Ukraine's stalemate exposes our weakness, while Israel's resolve illuminates the path. Victory isn't achieved through land swaps and empty promises, but through unwavering determination.
It has been American government policy to change the prime minister in Israel. Whatever you think of him, he's the one who can put together coalitions. What have they done when the Iranian people took to the streets like in 2009? Nothing. So if you didn't have that terror regime oppressing the people of Iran and spreading their terror around the region, look at what's possible. Look at what's possible. Look at what Bahrain has achieved in recent years. Look at what Saudi has been able to achieve in recent years. There are developments in Saudi Arabia I never thought would be seen in generations in terms of liberalization. Now, does it yet look like Berkeley? No, thank God. And I always like to think there might be somewhere in liberal terms between Riyadh and Berkeley, and if we can find that civilizational G-spot, let's do it. But Saudi has done extraordinary things, and the same with the Emiratis. I mean, you have Israelis holidaying in the UAE, and you have international businesses doing business in Saudi. You have pop concerts in Saudi. Again, I mean, okay, it feels like, yeah, well, we were there a while ago, fine. This was a society that had not caught up with the 8th century until a few years ago. And it's coming into the 21st century. And there is this opportunity to say, look, how about if everything normalized, look at what the Israelis could do with these countries in terms of water supplies, or technology, or crops, or new energy, or all of these things. Look at what's possible. And there is a future possible for the region. It does not involve the mullahs in Tehran having power, and it is not predicated on Mahmoud Abbas or the PA or whatever comes next in Gaza creating the perfect Palestinian state. The region cannot wait for that. It has waited for that for decades, and the Palestinian leadership has never been serious about it. It never wanted it. It walked away like it walked away in 1947, 1948. And again, I mean, I'm a little hard line on this at this point, but I believe that if you have kept being offered a state and you have kept waging war, you do not continue to have the right to keep on being handed state after state after state. If the Palestinians want another state, they should earn it, as everybody else has, as Israel did. But by the way, what I just said is so far out of the Overton window in Washington still, where it's like, let's give them more states.
But what do you do if you're Israel?
Foreign policy experts are trapped in a delusional time warp. They obsess over Palestinian statehood fantasies while ignoring seismic shifts in the region. Saudi Arabia and UAE leap into the 21st century. Yet these fossils cling to failed 1948 paradigms. Their misguided even-handedness coddles warmongering Palestinian leadership, rewarding rejection with more chances. It's madness. No more free passes for those who choose conflict over progress. Want statehood? Earn it through peace, not perpetual victimhood.
In other words, I don't disagree with the idea that if the Palestinians of the West Bank were given a state tomorrow, that would likely turn toward Hamas, and then
At best, it'll be another failed Arab state, and most likely it'll just be another Iranian proxy state. So well done, all you kids on campus who thought that everything in the world would unfurl into peace if another rotten state was created in the Middle East.
But then occupation forever?
No,
Then what?
that's for the Israeli government to work out. Among others. And by the way, you know, one of the things about the Palestinian question, to my mind, is that just take Gaza for the time being. It's very hard to know what you do with Gaza now. I don't think the Israelis should reoccupy it. I'm very nervous about the fact that there will almost certainly have to be IDF at the Philadelphia corridor, because my colleague and friend Natasha Hausdorff was down at the Philadelphia corridor the other week, which is the strip between Gaza and Egypt, a piece of land that most Western journalists seem to not know exists. But anyway, I'm nervous about the fact that IDF will have to be at the Philadelphia corridor, but they have to be because, as Natasha showed me the photographs the other day, these huge tunnels, and as big as any of the tunnels I've seen in Gaza in the last year, are for military-sized vehicles to drive through, driving rockets and ammunition into Gaza, and they're all under Egyptian army checkpoints. So obviously the Egyptians can't be trusted with that from stopping them getting in. So yes, there will have to be Israeli troops at the Philadelphia corridor. I'm very nervous about it, however, because I think that we will hear for many years of young men and women in the IDF patrolling that and getting shot or kidnapped by terrorists in Gaza.
Israel's caught in a vicious trap. West Bank statehood, a recipe for another terror-sponsoring hellhole. Permanent occupation, unsustainable. Gaza's a nightmare with no good options. Reoccupation's out, but the Philadelphia corridor demands IDF presence. Egypt's proven useless against Hamas's smuggling tunnels. It's a lose-lose. Leave it open, weapons pour in, patrol it, Israeli soldiers become targets. No clean solutions here, just brutal, bloody trade-offs.
However, something has to be done for the people of Gaza, with the people of Gaza. I think they should hopefully have learned by now that there is a terrible price to pay for voting for a terrorist group to run you. And if something can be done, among other things, that you don't have groups like UNRWA teaching young Gazan kids. They had 18 years to run the Gaza, and they brought up a generation of sociopaths. They brought them up with math books that, like, if you kill 2 Jews and then kill 2 more Jews, how many dead Jews have you got? That's like math in Gaza. I mean, this is sick, and we've known about it for years, and it was tolerated for years by the Americans and all the other Westerners as we poured money into these corrupt organizations. But it's not clear what you do about Gaza. But why should this be Israel's problem alone? If Washington doesn't have an answer for Gaza, and Egypt doesn't, and they don't want it back, and the rest of the world does, why would people keep on saying it's Israel's problem alone to solve? Whatever happens in Gaza should be a regional agreement with regional investment, regional security deals, but the absolute bottom line is never again will young Israelis have to lose their lives going in to fight another conflict to get Iranian rockets that have come through Egypt out of Gaza. this should be the last round. I said this at the beginning of this war. Will this be the umpteenth Gaza war or the last one? Will this be the third Lebanon war or the last one? My hope is this is the last Gaza war, this is the last Lebanon war.
Something must change for the people of Gaza, burdened by Hamas's rule. Their leadership choices have consequences, and ongoing support for militant groups fosters devastation. It's not just Israel's responsibility. Gaza's future should involve regional collaboration, investment, and security initiatives. The endless cycle of conflict can't continue. This must be the last Gaza war, and a comprehensive solution requires collective regional effort to prevent further bloodshed.
I want to go back to October of 2023 because there were two catastrophes of that week in October. The first, of course, was the Hamas pogrom, where 1,200 people were killed, more than 250 taken hostage, many of whom are still in the terror tunnels deep beneath Gaza. And the second was what started to happen and has continued to happen every day since October 8th, which was the sight of some of the most well-educated people in the West taking to the streets, waving Hamas flags, waving now Hezbollah flags, chanting glory to the martyrs. And now you have, by the way, the same moment that we're sitting here, I think today is the publication day of Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, The Message, which is based on a 10-day trip that he took to what he calls Palestine.
Well, it's quite interesting that Ta-Nehisi Coates, for the first time in his life, has decided to write about something other than his specialized subject, which is himself.
No, it's still about himself.
Oh, it is?
Yes, it is.
Okay, because, I mean, this is somebody who wrote his first book. It was a memoir, and it was about how incredibly prejudiced against he was. My view, when your first book, and you have no public presence before, is a memoir, it means you're doing pretty well in the publishing world. If your second book is also a memoir, you're doing really well. So yeah, it's interesting that Coates should have applied himself to the most complex question in international geopolitics over a 10-day period, and utterly typical of him. And he should probably get another MacArthur Genius
That's
Grant.
that's why I bring it up, right? This is a person whose projects are produced by Oprah, who has won pretty much every prize that there is to win in the Western world.
He won more prizes in a shorter space of time than Caitlyn Jenner. Probably some of the same prizes, all those courage ones.
Well, he's won a lot. And he's going on television right now. And by the way, this book for many young people will be the only thing that they read about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is what is contained in this book. Yes. And so it's this strange split-screen reality that I want you to comment on, because on the one hand, as you've said, you see a vision that's sort of emerging of a different Middle East that feels almost, you could say, hopeful, despite the horrors that have happened and the horrors that will surely happen in the coming days. But on the other hand, it's a very different reality sitting here in America. Coates' book being only one example of this phenomenon. The reality is that, there are people in this room who are students at Columbia University who lost their friends and their reputations and didn't get good grades because their professors knew that they supported the state of Israel. That is now normative in American life, to say nothing of the physical assaults that have happened to many people on college campuses and beyond that. How do you square the maybe sight of victory for Israel abroad and the reality for Jews here in America who always believed, or at least since 1945 have believed, that this country was exceptional for us? Talk to us a little bit about how you see ascendant anti-Semitism, normalized anti-Semitism, and what can be done about it.
October 2023 shattered illusions as Western elites cheered for terror, exposing a moral abyss. Israel battles existential threats, while academia punishes pro-Israel voices, revealing a twisted valorization of victimhood. This isn't enlightenment, it's intellectual cowardice masquerading as virtue. The real tragedy? Truth is buried under layers of fashionable deceit. It's time to rip off the blindfolds and confront this grotesque charade with relentless honesty.
Well, one of the things I was very struck about in Israel after the 7th was delegations started to come through from America and Canada and Britain and elsewhere. Delegations of Jews and Christians and others just trying to show support, really. Often doing menial tasks like picking fruit in the south that needed picking and that sort of thing. a large number of them I found would say things over dinner or over a drink or whatever, something along the following lines. I can't understand what's happened, Douglas. I'm a liberal. I was there for Me Too. I was there for BLM. And after the 7th, no one was there for me. And I always said the same thing, which was, welcome.
What do you mean by that?
That was always going to be the case. You're a fool to think that BLM didn't go the way it did, or that Occupy Wall Street wouldn't go. Why do all these movements go to anti-Semitism straight away? They're rancid movements. They're rancid movements based on half-truths and lies. And everything based on that will always fall into the supreme paranoid lie, which is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a psychosis that human beings are very vulnerable to, and the Jews' tragedy is that they provide such an easy excuse for people who are failing in their lives in all sorts of ways. And as I've often said, the amazing thing about anti-Semitism is the Jews can simultaneously be accused of being rich and of being poor, of being integrated and not integrating enough, and of being stateless and of having a state. But, in a line I've been trying to popularize in the last year from Vasily Grossman, everywhere it tells you nothing about the Jews, what it tells you about is the person who suffers from anti-Semitism. And as Grossman says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. Let me give you the supreme example of that. The Arab world and the Muslim world accuses Israel of being a colonial state. It's so funny. Islam is one of the great colonial projects in history. In history. The Muslim world expanded through violent colonialism. Now, that doesn't mean that all Muslims approve of that or love it, but they certainly live in the history of that. The Ottoman empires and all of these are all colonial movements. The whole of Islam is a colonial movement. And they have the gall to say that the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, where they existed long before Muhammad's mother came around, should be regarded as the colonial power. This doesn't tell you anything about Israel, it tells you about the Muslim and Arab world. They are colonialists, so they accuse Israel of being colonialists.
Leftist darlings turned their backs on Jews after October 7th. Surprise! These movements were always rotten, built on lies and half-truths. Anti-Semitism, the ultimate paranoid delusion, infects failing minds like a virus. The supreme irony, Islam, history's grand colonizer, dares call Israel colonial. It's projection or on steroids. This twisted logic exposes the accuser's guilt, not the accused. Time to rip off the mask of righteous indignation and face the ugly truth.
But the case, the very, very interesting case, which all of the psychiatrists and psychologists in New York could not work out if you got them all together, of the American student mind. Well, that is very interesting. And I'd say a couple of things. The first is, these are young people searching for a cause, and they've been given a cause by wicked people. And they'll have to decide in their lives what they think about that. If you chant Intifada, you are chanting for something like the suicide bomber who went into a university in Jerusalem 20 years ago and detonated in the cafe, killing American students, among others. Are you happy with that? Are you happy with that? When you say you want the Intifada everywhere, do you really mean you want your fellow students to be blown up whilst buying a cappuccino? Really? Like, have you thought about this at all? Are you this morally frivolous or wicked? So, These are, by the way, and these are people who have joined a losing side. This is very important to stress. They've joined a losing side. They have joined a death cult. They have joined a death cult. They celebrate a death cult. When they celebrate and reiterate mottos shouted by Hamas and Hezbollah, they should know that the people they're shouting support for are in the dust now. I suppose some of these people have got fed up of sending wreaths by now. Maybe they should have loyalty cards with Interflora. Send flowers to all of the people they worshipped who are no more. Their horrible belief is going the way that anti-Semitic death cults have gone throughout history. There is a reason why people abhor the Nazis. They were the same type of people, and they were ground into the dust of history. Hamas, Hezbollah, the mullahs will go as well. And these young people who decided to spend their formative years fasting or shitting into a bucket in the middle of Columbia University while saying they were doing it for Hamas, well done, guys. Well done. Your movement was less fragrant than it seemed.
Today's youth are seduced by hollow slogans, unwittingly chanting support for death cults that celebrate terror. While they're busy romanticizing imaginary intifadas, they ignore history's grim lesson. Such ideologies always fall. Have they pondered the absurdity of wishing fellow students blown to bits over cappuccinos? Congratulations, they're following failed legacies ground into history's dust. Enjoy the stench of your fading cause, campus crybabies.
Those people who are shouting Intifada are not thinking of the people murdered in the Hebrew U cafeteria. They're thinking, I was told this is what it means to be on the right side of history.
Yeah, exactly. And
that's what
they were told they were on the right side of history as they were chasing Jews across campus shouting, "Go back to Poland." Do you think you might have been the bad guys? You think?
What do we do about the fact, though, that this is one of a lot of alarming statistics? 51% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24, all of them with an IV right into TikTok, I'm sure, said that Israel believed that Israel should be ended and given to Hamas and to the Palestinians. Just as a practical matter, we can sit here and say, ha-ha, they're shitting in buckets, ha-ha, they're idiots. That's the next generation of American citizens. What do we do about that?
Well, the first thing is we should pray they never get what they want. Pray they never get what they want. If they got what they wanted for and what they chant for, they would end up waking up and realizing that they were the Nazis. Hamas, Hezbollah, the regime in Tehran, this is no overstatement for once, wishes to finish the work of Adolf Hitler in our time. If they managed, if Iran got the nuclear bomb and the Ayatollahs used it, that's it. And the Jewish people who survived Pharaoh and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Romans and Mengele would have been done in our own time. You sure you'd be happy to live with that? Young Columbia student. So no, I pray that they never, for many reasons, that they never get what they say they want.
Today's youth, indoctrinated through TikTok, blindly echo calls to dismantle Israel, oblivious to the catastrophic reality it entails. Not realizing they'd wake up aligned with the darkest chapters of history, they naively rally for an outcome mirroring genocidal ambitions. They've got no clue that their chance for an almost apocalyptic shift would annihilate a people who've endured every tyranny. Imagine that. Future American citizens rallying for a new Holocaust.
One of the alarming lessons of the past decade, or at least one lesson I'm learning, I'm sure you know it years before me, is I always used to comfort myself in a certain sense by saying, oh, people grow out of it. People grow out of it. And I don't feel that way anymore. I don't see people just naturally growing out of something that is being reinforced by so many of the institutions in their lives, by the people they admire, not just by their professors, but by many people in the culture who let these lies go unchallenged.
Yeah, well, as I say, there's a lot of rot in the culture. There's a lot of rot in institutions.
Well, you said earlier that we're kind of drunk on peace, or the way a lot of other people have
Yeah.
said it
Well,
is
so these
we're a
people-
decadent society. Like,
Yeah, of course,
is it going to take something catastrophic
It will take a
happening
mass
to us?
casualty terror attack. Probably. Probably, sadly. You know, there's a line from T.S. Eliot, that rather sobering line in Murder in the Cathedral, where he says, "We do not know very much about the future, except from generation to generation. We do the same thing again and again. Men learn little." And yeah, I think that most likely a mass casualty terror attack would be about the only thing that would bring the reality of this home. I mean, if these students who do this, if they realize that if they had any imagination, if they had any sympathy or empathy, can you imagine? Of course they don't imagine. Imagine that the Nova Party had taken place in New York. Imagine that at 6:30 in the morning, rockets started to land over your head. Imagine within about 20 minutes, big bearded men with machine guns and Kalashnikovs and grenades came and raped your friends in front of you and then killed them in front of you and then came for you next. And in your last moments, that was what you saw. One of the, without getting too gruesome, but let me just perhaps do so for once to hit home the point. One of the people who I interviewed who had been in the Nova Party had said at one point that there was a young girl on her knees. One of the Hamas terrorists had killed her best friend in front of her, and they were debating whether or not they should take her into Gaza or kill her, and she was screaming, "Please don't kill me, please don't kill me," and they shot her through the face, and she was still shouting that when her face fell off. That's what these guys are.
Imagine the horror, rockets raining down, bearded men with guns invading, raping and murdering your friends. Picture a girl begging for life as her face is blown off. This isn't fiction. It's the reality that these campus activists ignorantly champion. They're not just misguided, they're complicit in advocating for unimaginable brutality. Their chants echo with the screams of real victims. The cause of these woke snowflakes is drenched in innocent blood.
Does any student in America understand this, or can have any understanding that these people would do that to them? My just prayer is that they don't, that they're simply lacking in imagination. But if this happened to them, and if this happened to them and they, like the Nova survivors, came to New York for an exhibition about the Nova Party, and then they find in the streets of New York outside the exhibit American students and others chanting support for the people who did this to their friends, I don't know how some of these survivors, they're so brave, these young people, to still be going around the world telling their story. When they go around much of the world and they meet people they tell their story to, who are supporting the people who did it. This is a level of human evil I don't think that, human lack of empathy perhaps I can say, that is beyond my comprehension. I just want to say one other thing on that. We have seen something like this before. We saw it in the 60s and 70s when part of the left in Europe decided to take up the cause of the PLO. You know, very interestingly, one of the things about the Entebbe raid that people don't realize is that two of the hijackers were members of the German left. One of them used to live with former Foreign Minister Schröder. And they had decided after World War II there was one thing they wouldn't be, which was they wouldn't be Nazis. And this is quite a good idea. It's it's a good orienting principle, you know. Don't be Nazis. But I just want to stress that even that isn't enough on its own, not with other moral cause to you, not with other other things in your system. Because by the 60s, the PLO and all of those groups, some of the German left fell into that. And one of the things about the Entebbe hijacking, which is not well enough known, is that when the plane was landed in Uganda, the main hijacker, the German leftist, sorted out the passengers, Jews and non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Jews and non-Jews. Now, it wasn't just Israelis and non-Israelis. They got the American Jews into the line with the other Jews. And there was a man on the plane at Entebbe, one of several people on the plane who was a Holocaust survivor. And as he heard this German left-winger shouting orders to the Jews after the selection process, he showed his tattoo from the camp and said, "I had thought that people had changed." And the hijacker has been quoted by several people present as having said to that man, "I'm not a Nazi, I'm an idealist." We've seen these people before, but we've seen them off before.
I wondered before we go to questions,
Naive fools chant for terror. Blind to the horror they invite, these idealists sought humans like Nazis, championing butchers while claiming virtue. History's grim joke repeats self-righteous ignorance breeds monsters. Our campuses birth tomorrow's tyrants, drunk on lies and TikTok propaganda. When reality strikes, will they wake from their moral coma? Or will we all pay for their willful stupidity?
you've met so many people in your time in Israel. You've talked to survivors. You've gone to jails where terrorists are being held. You've, of course, met with so many political leaders. You shared an image I don't think any of us will ever forget about what happened to the woman on her knees at the Nova Festival, and I think each one of us in this room has different images that we go back to. I wondered if you could give us a different kind of image, because one of the things you talked about when you recently won the Alexander Hamilton Award is you've said that your friends have commented to you that you've changed since October 7th. And the way that you've changed is that you're actually less pessimistic. So give us some reasons that you've left some of that pessimism behind, maybe through some people that you've met.
Well, the real thing, is that one of the first times I was in Israel, I had a very a rather personal feeling. I haven't actually said this before, but there was rocketing in the north, and I hadn't been under any serious bombardment before. I'd seen stuff in Iraq and elsewhere. And I remember coming back from a day in the north where there's been rocketing, as there was again recently in the town of Sfat. And I thought something very strange when I got home, which was I thought I could look my grandparents in the face. And what I mean by that is, for my generation in Britain, it was always the question, would we be able to do what our grandparents had done? Living through the Blitz in London, night after night, and not losing their faith and not losing their strength. And I used to hear stories of that, terrible stories, when I was growing up, of what that was like. And from those who went and fought, the ones who didn't come back. And in my country of birth, Great Britain, like in America, every country is filled with family stories. My grandmother on my father's side lost her father in the First War and then her brothers in the Second. And always fighting the Germans. And every family was like that. And it was always this question of, if the time of trial came, would we be up to it? And that was what, just in my small little way that day, I remember thinking. I got a little taste of what my forebears went through. Tiniest one. But everyone in the West, somewhere in our back of our heads, has this thing. And Israelis had it, always, until, there was always a thing, since 1973 in particular, and the first Lebanon War, second Lebanon War. Always this question of, are the young people going to be up to it?
Rockets rain down, and suddenly our cushy lives are exposed. We've grown soft, forgetting the steel in our grandparents' spines, now faced with real danger. Do we crumble or stand tall? This isn't some history book fantasy, it's a gut check moment. Are we worthy of those who bled before us, or just pathetic shadows? The enemy's at the gates. Time to prove we're not just talk, but true inheritors of grit and courage.
I have so much admiration and pride and so much more that this generation of young Israelis were put to the test, and they've been magnificent. And if you see what these young men and women do on a daily basis, from the south of Gaza to the mountains of Lebanon and Syria in the north, and they don't do any of it with hatred in their hearts. They don't. Some of what they have to do, just some of what they've had to do is just beyond description. But they do it from love of their country, love of their people, love of their tradition, defense of their people, defense of their tradition. They know that they are fighting for the Jewish people as their forebears have before, but this time with a state, with an army, with an air force. And they've stepped up to this moment, and they have been extraordinary. People will write books about this generation. And I just say, the best thing about it is that it should tell us that there is also a better way. There is a better way than this nihilism and hatred which has been bred in America. There is something else other than this culture of resentment and failure, and it is failure. There is something better than this culture of grievance and I don't have enough, or someone else must have something. Or as Ronald Reagan said once, this idea that if there's a fat man standing by the side of a thin man, it must mean the fat man took something from the thin man. There is something else than this thing that has ended up in the last year being a celebration of a death cult. There is such a thing as gratitude instead of resentment, pride instead of envy, and pride in the real sense, pride in something you should be proud of, pride in protecting your people and your faith and your community, and indeed, in my view, the civilized world. So I've just met, I can't even begin listing the number of people, but anyone who feels down from spending too much time with people in America should come to Israel, and you will see that, among other things, the people who thought that the next generation of Israelis just wanted to party were wrong. And it turned out not to be an either-or thing. You can fight for your country and your people, and you can still dance. And that's what they're showing.
Israel's youth stand as a beacon of strength, defying the West's culture of victimhood and entitlement. While American campuses breed resentment, Israeli youth face rockets with unwavering resolve. They don't whine about microaggressions. They confront real aggression head-on. This isn't just bravery, it's a slap in the face to the grievance mongers. True pride isn't in hashtag activism, but in defending one's people and values. It's time we learned real resilience trumps manufactured outrage every time. Douglas Murray unleashes a blistering takedown of the West's feeble response to Middle East chaos, ripping apart the moral black holes in our institutions and media. As Iran's missiles rain down on Israel, are our leaders lost in a fog of virtue signaling, turning campuses into radical echo chambers? Murray skewers the so-called peacemakers, who through their cowardly inaction embolden terror, mistaking spinelessness for diplomacy. He champions Israel's grit as a glaring contrast to Western floundering, declaring this not just a conflict, but a battle for civilization itself. Are you sick of the spineless chatter? Smash that like button, subscribe, and dive into the fight for truth. What's your take on this explosive issue? Let your voice be heard in the comments.